Monday, December 13th, 1937. The first day. 8. Tajima's battalion was among the first units that blasted their way through the city walls. A couple of hours after midnight, while other units were still pounding China Glory, Sun Yat-sen, Heavenly Peace, and other gates of the city, his battalion was already charging into the city, mopping up retreating Chinese troops. Even though it was still quite dark, Tajima would glance back every now and then as if he could see the rising sun fluttering proudly on top of where China Gate had once been. He saw something else too. Bodies of thousands of soldiers of the Nagoya division that had been mowed down while attempting a forced landing at the Wusong Dock right outside Shanghai, where the Yangtze River merged into the South China Sea. He came upon them, scorched by the late afternoon sun. He had put a hand to his nose instinctively. The bodies had decomposed grotesquely, the entries bursting through ripped, parched skin, the bones cleaned by armies of maggots, the swarms of fat, black flies buzzing from one corpse to the other. That was what met his eyes when Tajima landed at the same embankment back in late August. A hardened soldier even then, Tajima was dazed and shocked by what he saw. Had they underestimated the strength of the Chinese resistance? Now, with the memory assaulting his senses as he moved forward in the pre-dawn darkness, he again smelled the putrid stench of death, and his body trembled with blinding anger and hate. Since that day at the Wusong Dock, Tajima had been fighting with a fuming vengeance. By the end of 3 months of brutal battles, he had lost 2/3 of his company, thanks to the damn good fight the Chinese had put up to defend Shanghai. When a triumphant imperial army at last turned to march westward to Nanking, he found himself in command of a newly reinforced battalion. He became Lieutenant Colonel Tajima Masanori. The Japanese victory in Shanghai seemed to have dealt a fatal blow to the Chinese resistance. After Shanghai, they had simply lost the will to fight. Over a stretch of more than 300 kilometers, and at each one of the 5 or 6 important cities and towns in between Shanghai and the capital, the Chinese troops put up a half-hearted fight for a few days and then turned around and ran. Within a month, Tajima had advanced to the city walls of Nanking. From the fierce skirmishes Tajima's battalion had encountered in the outskirts and outlying areas, and from the intelligence briefings he received from Brigadier General Nagamoto Tadia, Tajima had been bracing for another Shanghai, a fierce resistance akin to a last stand. After all, Nanking was the capital and was being guarded by more than a dozen divisions, more than twice the number of Japanese troops. Then, almost as if by magic, the ancient city wall was breached. He couldn't believe it, even when he saw the gaping holes in the wall with his own eyes. Those Chinese, Tajima mused. If this were Tokyo, he and his warriors would have lived or died on the wall. Tajima took a deep breath, his left hand caressing the handle of the sword at his hip. Up ahead, he could see the tail end of Akiyama Yoshichika's company that was already spearheading into the city. The streets were strewn with abandoned rifles, beddings, torn uniforms, dead bodies huddled amid collapsed roofs, fallen walls, and smoldering ruins. Outside the city, the slopes of Purple Mountain had quieted after a night of thunderous explosions. The morning air still quivered with sporadic gunshots from Tajima's own troops. The sky over the mountain began to glow with a ghostly pale light. Tajima saw a soldier from Captain Akiyama's company running back toward him. "Sir," the soldier reported, "a large number of Chinese troops, about half a kilometer ahead, are ready to surrender." "How many?" Don't know yet, sir. Tell Captain Akiyama to approach cautiously, just in case. Yes, sir. The soldier turned around and soon disappeared into the dim early morning air. An interesting development, Tajima thought, prancing ahead. In a few minutes he saw it, a huge white bedsheet fluttering pitiably tied to a tree. He chuckled contemptuously while picturing panicky Chinese soldiers ransacking residents' homes to find their white flag. Then he stopped, stunned by what he saw. He had entered a large city square paved with flat stones. Its periphery was barely visible in the nebulous early morning air. The square was occupied by an immense blur of human forms sitting on the ground, motionless, like animals, like ants, like worms. There must have been 1,000, a full-force regiment at least. A dozen more white flags made of white shirts dangling on raised sticks or tree twigs. The occasional twinkle of a cigarette drag near and far, giving him a vague sense of the vastness of whatever was sprawled in front of him. They had all just surrendered, refusing to fight the enemy. But why? Because to live, even as a coward, seemed preferable than to fight the enemy to the death in the battlefields? Tajima couldn't understand that. Surrendering to the enemy, wouldn't it be 100 times worse than death itself? He would never consider such a shameful, despicable act under any circumstances. His troops had already surrounded the large square. Machine guns had been mounted, bayonets drawn towards the sitting human forms. Tajima realized that he had thousands of prisoners on his hands now, soldiers who had apparently been abandoned by their commanding officers. He had dealt with the prisoners before and had heard of a set of top-secret kill-all captives orders issued recently. But the sheer size of the prisoners in front of him making kill them all a major undertaking. Lieutenant Colonel Tajima called for the 3 company commanders to gather around him and gave them instructions. Captain Akiyama then walked in front of the massive multitudes on the square. "Listen!" Akiyama shouted in his slow, broken Chinese. "You will be led to different places so that surrender procedures can be conducted properly." After a moment of confusion, the prisoners stood up all at once. A frightening forest of ragged uniforms, dust-caked faces, and eyes filled with something between hope and despair. They formed columns, 5 deep, each column following a white flag and a junior Japanese officer who was barking orders all the while, and marched in 20 directions at the same time, like sheep, bayonet rifles pointed at their backs. Could these be the warriors that had been defending the city over the last few days? Tajima wondered as he followed the long, thick column closest to him toward open ground not far from the square. The platoon leader, a newly commissioned young officer, made the prisoners form lines of 9 each. After a few confusing minutes, about 20 such lines were formed. The young officer stood in front of the prisoners awkwardly, apparently at a loss over what to do next. It was Karuda Sanji, a cadet fresh out of the Army Infantry School, who had been assigned to Tajima's battalion right after Shanghai. The poor thing still needed some real training. Lieutenant Colonel Tajima jumped off his horse. "I'll show you how," he roared to Karuda and marched to the first line of prisoners. During his first year in middle school, Tajima used to be pushed around by bullies as the notorious sissy of the class. His homeroom teacher, Mr. Sagawa, a middle-aged man with a quick temper and veins bulging on his forehead like worms, would scream at him in front of the entire class. "You'll grow up to be a disgrace to the empire. I'll bet you 1,000 yen on that." Even his parents seemed to have resigned themselves to the fact that their sheepish boy would never amount to anything. If only the old rascal Sakawa, if only Otu-san, Papa, and Okasan Mama were all here now. Still thin and small in stature, Tajima had proved them all wrong. All he had taken was seen blood in real battles and an enormous amount of mulish willpower. Tajima stopped about a meter away from the first prisoner in the line, a lad about 15 or 16 years old who was shaking uncontrollably. Several prisoners behind the lad began to remove their watches or whatever they thought were valuables in their persons and raise them above their heads. "Want to bribe your executioners?" Tajima thought, drawing out his wakizashi sword. It was a family treasure that Otu-san, a veteran, awarded the Order of the Rising Sun for his valor during the 1904-1905 Russo-Japanese War, had bequeathed him the night before Tajima was leaving for the Army Infantry School. From then on, Father's spirit had been guarding him wherever he went. Tajima spun the sword around a few times. Its long, sharp blade glinted in the first flush of morning sunshine. He rested the back of the blade on the lad's neck to judge the distance, checked the position of his legs, turned the blade back to the front, drew it back, and in an elegant sweeping arc, let it fall. There was swishing sound like the sound of the wind stirring in the trees, and before the young lads had hit the ground, a thick stream of blood shot forth fiercely from the neck stump. The lad's knees buckled and he fell listlessly to the ground. Tajima felt a splash of thick warm drops on his face. He tasted something salty in his mouth and spat it out. Wiping his sword with a towel, Tajima turned to glance at poor Karuda, who was standing about 2 or 3 meters behind him, watching with apparent unease. Still further behind was the figure of Brigadier General Nakamoto astride his tall horse, silhouetted against the pale early morning light. So the general had caught up too. "Come closer, young man," Tajima growled to Karuda. "You'll learn." As he moved on to the second man in line, a voice somewhere in the group broke into song. A few long seconds passed, but then all the prisoners, all of them, joined in. It was another one of those Resist Japan songs. Tajima had heard them before in the northeastern provinces and in the streets of Shanghai. They sang as if they accepted the inevitable fate that was to befall them. Tajima muttered to himself, "You should have been singing with your rifles, your machine guns, and your cannons in the battlefield just a bit more fiercely. 10 hours ago, yesterday, last week. Now, too late." Quickly now, he raised his sword above the downturned head of the second prisoner, a disheveled 40-ish man in a dirty blue cotton petticoat, and struck. The man's face was frozen in agony as the sword cut cleanly through his neck. His body collapsed amid a shower of red spray. His head thudded to the ground and rolled pitifully at Karuda's feet. Tajima progressed further along the first line of prisoners with unabated ferocity. The memory of the Wuzong dog came flooding back and animated his limbs. He felt like an authentic reincarnation of Miyamoto Musashi. He struck repeatedly, 3, 4, 5, 6. Death certainly was instantaneous. He was being merciful. Paused to check if his sword got bent or warped, and struck again. 7, 8. He had heard of the contest to cut down 100 that had been going on between 2 second lieutenants. It had started 2 weeks ago in Changzhou and had been cheered along by glowing reports in the Tokyo Nichi-Nichi Shinbun. By the time they reached the outskirts of Nanking, the second lieutenant from Yamaguchi Prefecture had already killed 106 with his sword, while the other second lieutenant's tally stood at 105. They had decided to extend their game, and only 2 days ago, a 150 campaign had begun. Not bad, Tajima thought as he struck the ninth and last prisoner in the line. With the last swing, he felt a slight tingling and soreness in his arms. He breathed deeply. Given time and a good sword, he thought, he could perhaps surpass 150 himself. 9 headless, crumpled bodies now lay where the first row of prisoners once stood. The ground was covered in blood. The severed heads, eyes upturned, lay randomly where they fell or rolled. The singing had stopped. The prisoners stood in silence, teetering on the brink of collapse, their heads hanging on their chests. Lieutenant Colonel Tajima turned and grinned at Kuruda. He wiped the sword clean before placing it in its scabbard, marched to where Brigadier General Nagamoto was, and saluted. The general nodded. As he and the general turned to leave, Tajima heard Kuruda barking orders to his soldiers. It will be quite a pretty sight once they have finished here, Tajima thought. Better than Wusong dog. Breakfast was being prepared for General Nagamoto in front of a house a little further down the road, where a small table had been set up. As Tajima joined Nagamoto, he felt tired, but his spirits were high. His nostrils opened to the fragrant aroma of rice being cooked, and he felt deep pangs of hunger as his stomach twitched. "Sir," Zamba came up to Brigadier General Nagamoto, "breakfast will be ready in a minute." From one of the neighboring houses, the man heard a muffled but unmistakable sobbing. A woman crying? Tajima wondered. "I'll go and have a look, sir," Zamba said to Nagamoto, and walked towards a nearby house where the roof had collapsed and the front door lay broken on the ground. Zamba disappeared from view for only a moment before returning. "It's a gunyang, sir," he reported with a smile. "A gunyang." Tajima laughed. "A flower like a girl here? Now isn't that something?" There was a pause, as if Tajima had waited in deference for the general. Nagamoto looked up from a trance, glanced down at his uniform, his gloved hands, and his mud-stained boots, and shook his head. Tajima stood up slowly and proceeded to walk toward the house. As he passed Zamba, he winked almost imperceptibly and whispered, "Our general is a bit fastidious, you know." He stepped inside and saw bodies lying sprawled on the dirt floor. An old man in a dark-colored cotton coat had been cut in half at the waist. An old woman was sprawled next to him. She had been stripped from waist down, her belly smeared with agglomerated blood. Huddling in a corner of the room was the gunyang, who was trembling uncontrollably and nearly choking on her own sobs. "Gunyang," Tajima said in his broken Chinese, grabbing the girl's collar to pull her up. His hands touched the soft skin of her neck. "Wei shema ku? Why do you cry?" The girl raised her head slowly with a vacant, expressionless look. Her long eyelashes were caked with dirt and dust, her tears creating rivers of black which streamed down her soot-covered face. Tajima guessed she was no more than 15 or 16. "A Hua Guliang, indeed." Tajima looked her over as a sudden lust leapt up and coursed through his body. How could the soldiers have possibly left her untouched? She must have been hiding somewhere and just crawled out, only to discover. Tajima threw the girl to the floor and crashed on top